Tonight, we shall embark upon a solemn expedition into one of history's most profound and harrowing chapters, exploring the era of the Black Death and imagining what it meant to endure this calamitous plague. So, I invite you to lower the lights, perhaps allowing the soft drone of a fan to create a gentle ambience as we begin this passage into the past. If these journeys into the past resonate with you, I invite you to express your appreciation and join our growing community of historical explorers. It is always a profound encouragement to learn from which corners of the globe you are listening, and at what hour, as we gather together across time and distance. Imagine, if you will, that you have just awakened in Europe in the year of our Lord 1347. The morning air is sharp and cool as your eyes flutter open, and you stretch your limbs upon a mattress densely packed with straw. Your surroundings are not those of a private bedchamber you might envision. Instead, you find yourself within a humble, single-room dwelling, sharing the space with the entirety of your family. The walls are constructed of wattle and daub, a framework of woven lattice filled with a composite of mud, clay, and straw. This construction is remarkably effective at keeping the cold at bay, though the thatched roof above is prone to leaking during periods of heavy rain. As you rise from your pallet, your senses are filled with familiar odors: the lingering scent of smoke from the previous evening's hearth fire, the earthy fragrance of the packed dirt floor under your feet, and the sharp tang of unwashed bodies. Ablutions are an infrequent luxury in this era. It is considered far safer than consuming water, which, if drawn from a tainted source, can bring on a terrible sickness. Beyond the walls of your small cottage, the village is already stirring into wakefulness. You can discern the distant lowing of cattle, the clucking of chickens, and the voices of your neighbors as they commence their daily labors. The majority of people here are peasants who cultivate the land, either as free tenants paying rent to the local lord, or as serfs who are legally bound to the land and owe their labor in service. Life in your medieval village possesses a predictable and steady rhythm. The days are marked by the rising and setting of the sun, the weeks by the tolling of church bells summoning you to Mass, and the years by the relentless turning of the seasons and the agricultural cycle of planting and harvesting. It is an arduous existence, certainly, but it is the only one you have ever known. What you do not yet grasp, what no one in Europe can yet comprehend, is that the foundations of this world are about to be irrevocably altered. A shadow is advancing across the continent, a presence that will reshape society in ways no war or famine has ever accomplished. The initial whispers of this change arrive in your village on the lips of a traveling merchant. He is a purveyor of exotic wares from faraway lands, silks from the east, spices from distant shores. This time, however, he carries another cargo: stories. He speaks of terrifying accounts of a malady that has been laying waste to cities along the great trade routes. He claims that people are perishing by the thousands, struck down by a mysterious ailment that manifests as fever, agonizing swellings, and a nearly inescapable death. Some of the villagers cross themselves and whisper prayers. Others dismiss the merchant's tales as gross exaggerations. After all, alarming rumors frequently travel faster than the truth. The merchant departs, and for a time, life resumes its normal course. Yet the rumors persist, becoming more frequent and more dreadful with each passing month. By autumn, the whispers have escalated into cries of alarm. The sickness has now reached the Mediterranean ports of Europe: Messina, Marseille, Venice. It is said that ships have been arriving in harbors filled with nothing but corpses, their crews having succumbed during the voyage. God save us all, your mother murmurs upon hearing this news, making the sign of the cross. In your village, the people begin to prepare as best they can, although no one truly understands what they are preparing for. The victims, it is said, suffered from high fevers, complained of a terrible thirst, and developed peculiar black swellings in their armpits and groins. Few survived for more than 3 days after the first symptoms appeared. Your village elders convene to deliberate on a course of action. Some propose sealing the village off from all outsiders, while others contend that trade and communication are essential and must continue. Ultimately, life proceeds, though now it is shadowed by a new and pervasive undercurrent of fear. Then, one crisp morning, a young man who works at the mill does not report for his duties. When a villager goes to check on him, they discover him consumed by fever, his body drenched in sweat. His neck is swollen with a painful bubo the size of a hen's egg. The sequence is terrifyingly swift. One day, a person might appear perfectly healthy; the next, they are feverish. And by the third day, more often than not, they are dead. The black buboes that lend the disease its infamous name, the Black Death, are painful beyond all description. Some victims begin to cough up blood, a sign that the disease has invaded their lungs, and these unfortunate souls rarely survive for more than a day or two. It is a punishment from God, some declare, flogging themselves as penance for their sins. It is the bad air, others assert, carrying posies of flowers to ward off the foul miasma they believe to be the cause of the illness. It is the Jews poisoning the wells, a few mutter darkly, even though your village has no Jewish residents, and the phenomenon is called Yersinia pestis. This microscopic organism resides in the gut of fleas, which in turn travel upon the backs of rats. These rats, stowaways on merchant ships and constant companions in the towns and villages of the medieval world, have unwittingly ferried death across continents. When an infected flea bites a human, it regurgitates the bacteria into the wound. The bacteria then multiply with astonishing speed, frequently causing inflammation in the lymph nodes, those agonizing buboes. If the bacteria manage to reach the lungs, they trigger pneumonic plague, which can spread directly from one person to another through coughing and breathing. But you have no knowledge of any of this. All you know is that people are dying, and no one seems capable of stopping it. Your village, like thousands of others across Europe, is transformed by the plague. The church bells, which which once chimed to mark the hours and call the faithful to prayer, now toll incessantly for the dead. Eventually, the number of deaths becomes too great to announce individually, and the bells fall silent. The deceased are interred swiftly and with minimal ceremony. Gone are the elaborate funeral rites that once signified a person's transition from this world to the next. Now, bodies are collected on carts and transported to mass graves. Some families, devastated by multiple losses, have no one left to bury their own dead, and bodies might lie in homes for days until neighbors or parish officials finally remove them. Fear alters how people interact with one another. Those who still have healthy family members might bar their doors to all visitors, while those with sick relatives often find themselves shunned. Some flee to the countryside, hoping that distance will shield them from the disease. Others turn to religion with renewed intensity, processing through the streets while flagellating themselves to appease what they perceive as divine wrath. The priests, who ought to be a source of solace, are themselves dying in alarming numbers. Their duties compel them to administer last rites to the dying, constantly exposing them to the contagion. Many abandon their posts, leaving their flocks in this time of greatest need. Those who remain often succumb to the disease themselves. Your family, thus far, has been fortunate. Although the plague rages all around you, no one in your immediate household has fallen ill. You have heard accounts of entire families being annihilated in neighboring villages, of children orphaned only to perish themselves days later, of lovers parted by death mere hours after vowing eternal devotion. But in a world where the Black Death claims between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population, your luck cannot hold indefinitely. One morning, your younger brother complains of feeling unwell. By midday, he is burning with a high fever. By evening, the telltale swelling appears at his neck, and you understand its meaning. Your mother attends to him day and night, bathing his feverish brow with cool cloths, attempting to coax him into drinking small sips of water or weak ale. Your father speaks of taking him to the monastery, where monks tend to the sick, but it is common knowledge that the monasteries are overwhelmed, with many of the brothers themselves now victims of the plague. For 3 days, your brother's condition deteriorates. The bubo grows larger, turning from an angry red to a menacing black. His breathing becomes labored, and he cries out in a delirium of pain. You take turns sitting with him, though a primal fear makes you want to maintain your distance. On the 4th day, something unexpected occurs. While most plague victims worsen and die at this stage, your brother's fever breaks. He is weak, terribly so, but he is alert. The bubo remains, but it has softened somewhat, and over the subsequent days, it ruptures and drains, a disgusting yet hopeful sign. Against all odds, your brother is one of the few who will survive the Black Death. What you cannot possibly know is why he survived when so many others perished. Modern science would later reveal that certain individuals possess a genetic mutation called Delta 32, which provides a degree of protection against the plague bacterium. This mutation affects a protein known as CCR5, on the surface of white blood cells, making it more difficult for the bacteria to enter and commandeer immune cells. Your brother may well carry this mutation, as might others in your family. This genetic anomaly, a random accident of nature, would grant certain families and individuals a fighting chance against the deadliest pandemic in human history. Curiously, centuries later, scientists would discover that this very same mutation also confers protection against another lethal disease, HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. The Black Death, by selecting for survivors with this genetic trait, would inadvertently help safeguard some of their descendants from a disease that would not emerge for another 600 years. But that is a tale for another time. For now, your family celebrates your brother's recovery as the miracle it appears to be. Not everyone is so fortunate. As the weeks turn into months, the plague continues its deadly march. Your village, which once boasted a population of perhaps 200 souls, is now reduced to fewer than 100. Fields lie untended, as those who would have worked them are either dead or occupied with caring for the sick or burying the dead. The lord of the manor, who resides in a stone house on the hill overlooking the village, has lost his wife and 2 of his children. Even affluence and privilege offer no defense against the Black Death. Strangely, some individuals seem to be immune to the plague despite constant exposure. The village gravedigger, an unsavory character who pilfers from the dead before burying them, handles plague-ridden corpses daily, yet never displays any symptoms. A midwife who attends to the sick when she isn't delivering babies also remains healthy despite her perilous work. Like your brother, they may carry genetic protection, though medieval people would attribute their survival to divine intervention, or perhaps suspicious dealings with dark forces. Food grows scarce as the harvest is neglected and trade diminishes. The price of basic goods skyrockets, while anything perceived as a potential remedy, certain herbs, exotic treatments, religious relics, becomes astronomically expensive if it can be found at all. As winter approaches, the plague begins to recede, not due to any human action, but because of the disease's natural cycle. Fleas are less active in cold weather, and rats tend to stay closer to their nests. For a short time, there is hope that the worst has passed. But the Black Death is not finished. It merely retreats, only to return with the warming weather of spring, finding new victims among those who survived the initial wave. Over the next 4 years, from 1347 to 1351, successive waves of plague will sweep across Europe, killing somewhere between 75 and 200 million people, perhaps half of Europe's entire population. The world that emerges from this catastrophe will be fundamentally transformed. The massive decline in population will disrupt the feudal system, increase the value of labor, and shift power dynamics between peasants and the nobility. Religious authority will be questioned as people wonder why their prayers went unanswered and why so many priests abandoned their duties. Medical knowledge based largely on ancient texts and superstition, will be challenged by the plague's defiance of traditional treatments. For those who survive, people like your brother, the gravedigger, the midwife, life will never return to what it was before. They are the fortunate ones, though they bear the burden of survival in a world defined by loss. They will rebuild society, renegotiate their relationships with authority, and gradually construct a post-plague world that, for better or worse, sets Europe on a path toward modernity. But that is a story for tomorrow night. For now, as you drift toward sleep, imagine yourself as one of those medieval survivors, watching the first stars appear in the evening sky above your village. The plague has passed, at least for now. You have lived through humanity's darkest hour, and though you don't yet know it, you stand at the threshold of a new world. The distant barking of a dog, the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze, despite everything, despite unimaginable loss and suffering, life continues. And in that simple fact lies perhaps the most important lesson of the Black Death. A wave of profound relief washes over you, certainly, but it is tinged with an unfamiliar sensation, a sense of bewilderment as to why your family was spared when so many others were not. Strange survivor's guilt. This feeling of unworthiness amidst widespread suffering haunts many who live through such catastrophes. Your brother is weak but alert, his eyes clear for the first time in days. The drained bubo at his neck has left an ugly scar that will mark him for life, a permanent reminder of his brush with death. But a scar is infinitely preferable to a grave, and your family treats each day of his recovery as the precious gift it truly is. Why did I live when so many died? He asks one evening, his voice still raspy from illness. Your mother, lighting a rush candle as darkness descends, pauses before answering. It is God's will, she says simply, though her tone suggests she is not entirely convinced. The truth, which no one in the 14th century could possibly comprehend, is far more complex. Throughout human history, infectious diseases have acted as powerful agents of natural selection. Those with genetic advantages against specific pathogens survive at higher rates, passing these protective traits to future generations. The Black Death is perhaps the most dramatic example of this process in human history. Deep within your brother's cells, and perhaps yours as well, lies a genetic mutation that alters a protein called CCR5 on the surface of white blood cells. This mutation, known as Delta 32, creates a shortened version of the protein that makes it harder for the plague bacterium to enter and hijack immune cells. Some people have one copy of this mutation, providing partial protection. A fortunate few have two copies, giving them substantial resistance to the disease. It's a genetic lottery, and your brother happens to hold a winning ticket. But the cost of this evolutionary advantage is measured in millions of lives, those without the protective mutation who succumbed to the Black Death. As your brother regains his strength, venturing outside for the first time since his illness, you notice how dramatically the village has changed. Gardens that were once meticulously tended now grow wild. Houses stand empty, their owners dead or fled. The rhythmic sounds of daily work, the blacksmith's hammer, the weaver's loom, the miller's wheel, are muted or absent entirely. Yet amid this desolation, signs of resilience begin to emerge. No place has been spared, though some have suffered worse than others. Cities, with their crowded conditions and poor sanitation, have been particularly hard hit. Some small, isolated villages high in the mountains or deep in forests have fared better, though few have escaped entirely. In your region, perhaps half the population has perished. In some places, the toll is even higher. The merchant speaks of ghost towns where not a single soul remains alive, of monasteries where every monk lies dead in his cell, of noble families wiped out entirely, their grand estates left without heirs. But he also tells of places where life continues with surprising normality, of communities pulling together to care for orphans and widows, of unexpected kindnesses in a time of overwhelming hardship. In a village much like yours, a woman named Elizabeth lost her husband and 6 children to the plague within a single week. She dragged each of their bodies to a hillside behind their home and buried them herself, one by one. Yet somehow, despite this intimate contact with the disease, Elizabeth never became ill. Like your brother and the village gravedigger, she appeared to possess some natural immunity, that same genetic protection that modern science would one day identify. They say she's a witch, the merchant confides, lowering his voice, though there is no one nearby to overhear. How else could she touch the dead and live? Some wanted to drown her in the pond, but most were just grateful to have someone willing to bury their dead. Such rumors are common in these desperate times. Those who survive against the odds, particularly if they are women living alone or people with unusual habits or appearances, often find themselves suspected of dark dealings. Fear and superstition flourish alongside the plague, sometimes claiming victims of their own. Your father, who has been listening to the merchant's tales, shakes his head. There is no witchcraft in survival, he says firmly. Some are simply stronger against the sickness. Like my son, he places a proud hand on your brother's shoulder. The merchant nods agreeably, always careful not to contradict a potential customer. True enough, in every village, there are those the plague cannot touch. God's chosen, perhaps. As winter arrives, bringing with it bitter cold and early darkness, your village settles into a new routine. There are fewer mouths to feed, which means food stores will last longer than usual, a small mercy. But there are also fewer hands to chop wood, repair homes, care for livestock, and perform the 100 daily tasks necessary for survival in medieval times. This scarcity of labor creates subtle but significant shifts in the relationship between peasants and the nobility. Your father, a skilled carpenter, is suddenly in high demand. The lord of the manor, who once would have simply commanded his service, now finds himself negotiating, offering better terms for urgent repairs to the manor house. He offered me a silver penny for 3 days' work, your father tells your mother one evening, his voice low with amazement, and a side of bacon, Such wages would have been unthinkable before the plague. But with half the craftsmen in the region dead, those who survive find their skills valued as never before. Similar changes ripple through all levels of society. Farm laborers, once abundant and easily replaced, now command higher wages for their work. Household servants, especially those with experience running a large home, find themselves sought after by noble families whose staff have been decimated by disease. Widows who would once have remarried quickly now often choose to maintain their independence, running businesses left by their dead husbands. Guild restrictions that once kept women from certain professions are informally relaxed out of necessity. A woman in a neighboring village takes over her husband's blacksmith forge, scandalizing traditionalists, but providing an essential service no one else can offer. For serfs, peasants legally bound to the land they work, the plague creates unprecedented mobility. Many lords, desperate to keep their fields productive, offer freedom to serfs willing to stay and work. Others find they can simply leave, moving to towns or to other manors where conditions are better, with little fear of being forced back. With so many dead, enforcement of such restrictions becomes increasingly difficult. Not all these changes happen immediately, of course. The feudal system that has structured European society for centuries does not collapse overnight. But the seeds of transformation are planted in these early post-plague years, and they will grow in the decades to come. An opportunity arises for you that would not have existed before. The parish priest, one of the few clergy who neither died nor fled during the worst of the plague, needs someone to help maintain church records. With a basic literacy unusual for a peasant child taught by your mother, who once served in a noble household, you are suited for the task. Spring arrives, and with it comes both hope and fear. The warming weather brings new life, crops sprouting in fields, wildflowers dotting meadows, birds returning from their winter journeys. But it also brings the conditions that allow the plague to spread once more. Sure enough, by early summer, new cases appear. This second wave is less devastating than the first. There are fewer people to infect, and many of those who remain may carry some genetic resistance. Still, each new death reopens barely healed communal wounds. One afternoon, while helping the priest update the parish death register, a grimly long document, you ask a question that's been troubling you. Father, why did God send the plague? The priest, an older man with a face mapped by lines of sorrow, pauses in his work. Some say it's a punishment for our sins, he says finally. Others believe it's a test of faith. The Pope himself has called for prayer and penance to end the scourge. He dips his quill in ink, adding another name to the register. But I've seen the most pious die in agony, while notorious sinners live unscathed. I've prayed by the bedside of innocent children as the plague took them. He sighs heavily. Perhaps it is not for us to understand God's plan. This crisis of faith is repeated in communities across Europe. The plague defies medieval religious understanding. If it is divine punishment, why does it strike the virtuous and sinful alike? If prayer and penance are the cure? Why do devoted monasteries suffer some of the highest death rates? The authority of the Church, once nearly absolute in matters of earthly misfortune, begins to show cracks that will widen in the centuries to come. Medical knowledge faces similar challenges. Physicians trained in the most prestigious universities prove no more effective at treating plague than village healers. Their elaborate theories, based on bodily humors and astronomical alignments, fail to explain why some recover while others die, why some communities suffer worse than others. Some doctors bravely attend the sick, often sacrificing their own lives in the process. Others flee at the first sign of outbreak, prioritizing self-preservation over professional duty. Those who stay commonly wear distinctive protective clothing, long robes covered in wax, gloves, and a mask shaped like a bird's beak, filled with herbs and spices believed to purify the air. This strange outfit, which would become iconic in later plague outbreaks, does little to protect them from the actual source of infection. In the absence of effective official treatment, communities develop their own responses to the plague. Some are based on superstition, carrying talismans, reciting charms, avoiding black cats or people with red hair. Others have surprising practical value, isolating the sick, burning the belongings of plague victims, maintaining cleanliness. None offer complete protection, but these community-developed practices mark the doors of infected houses with white crosses. Visitors from outside the village must wait 3 days in a designated hut before entering to ensure they show no signs of disease. The dead are buried quickly with minimal ceremony, their possessions burned. These precautions help, but they cannot stop the plague entirely. By midsummer, your village has lost a dozen more people to the second wave, a serious blow to a community already diminished by the first outbreak. One victim is the lord of the manor himself, a man in his 50s who had survived the first wave only to succumb to the second. His death creates ripples of consequence throughout the local social hierarchy. His son, barely 20 and newly returned from university in Paris, inherits the manor and its lands. This new lord, young and influenced by novel ideas from his education, takes a different approach to managing the estate than his father did. Recognizing the scarcity of labor and the changing dynamics of power, he offers better terms to tenant farmers. Serfs who agree to stay and work the manor lands are granted their freedom and more favorable rents. Those with specialized skills, your father among them, receive privileges once reserved for those of higher social rank. Not all nobles adapt so readily to the new reality. In neighboring manors, some lords attempt to enforce old restrictions more harshly, forbidding peasants from leaving, punishing those who demand higher wages, using force to maintain the old order. These efforts rarely succeed for long. Peasants simply leave, seeking better conditions elsewhere. With land abundant and workers scarce, they find no shortage of opportunities. The plague's second wave finally recedes with the coming of autumn. Your village has survived, diminished but intact. Of the original 200 residents, perhaps 90 remain. Fields have been consolidated, with the most fertile land prioritized for cultivation. Houses stand empty, their timbers and thatch gradually scavenged for other uses. Yet life has a remarkable capacity to normalize, even after catastrophe. Children play in the village square again. The rhythms of agricultural life, planting, tending, harvesting, continue, adapted to the new reality. A mason, a man who left the village years ago to seek his fortune in the cities, has returned. He tells anyone who will listen, "I was working on the magnificent cathedral there, but when the plague struck, it devastated the city worse than any rural area. I watched half of Florence die. His eyes are haunted by memories. The rich fled to their country estates, but the poor had nowhere to go. Bodies piled in the streets faster than they could be buried. He decided to return to his birthplace. His story is not unique. Throughout Europe, the plague causes a temporary reversal of the centuries-long trend of urbanization. Cities, with their crowded conditions, are perfect breeding grounds for disease. Many who survive flee to the countryside, seeking safety in open spaces and smaller communities. This urban exodus brings unexpected benefits to rural villages like yours. People return with new skills, new ideas, and new perspectives gained from their time in cities. They bring tales of different ways of living, of technological innovations, of political systems, unlike the feudal structure of rural areas. The Mason, for instance, describes how Florence was governed not by a hereditary noble, but by elected officials from the merchant class. He speaks of mechanical clocks that divide the day into precise hours, of water management systems that bring clean water into the city, of banking practices that allow trade across vast distances. These ideas find fertile ground in communities already questioning traditional authorities and practices. The plague has created cracks in the medieval worldview, and through these cracks, new possibilities emerge. For you and your family, life continues in this altered landscape. Your brother fully recovered though scarred by his encounter with the plague, apprentices to the returned mason, learning the skilled craft that will provide him a secure future in a world where such skills are increasingly valued. Your father's carpentry keeps the family comfortable, his services now commanding wages that would have been unimaginable before the plague. Your mother no longer takes in washing, instead focusing on a herb garden that produces remedies in high demand since the plague depleted the ranks of traditional healers. You continue assisting the priest with parish records, your literacy and quick mind making you valuable in a community where such skills are rare. In the old world, your peasant birth would have limited your prospects regardless of your abilities. In the post-plague world, with its fluid social boundaries and desperate need for talent wherever it can be found, opportunities expand before you. One evening, as your family sits around the hearth, sharing a meal more abundant than any you might have hoped for in the pre-plague years, your father voices what many are thinking. It's a terrible thing to say, he begins hesitantly, but for those of us who survived, life is better now than before. Your mother nods slowly. More food, better pay, more freedom, she agrees, built on countless graves. It is the uncomfortable paradox at the heart of the post-plague world. For those fortunate enough to survive, whether through genetic luck like your brother, circumstantial fortune, or simple isolation from infection sources, the new world offers advantages the old one never could. The massive reduction in population creates opportunities for social advancement, economic improvement, and personal freedom that would have been unthinkable in the crowded, rigidly hierarchical pre-plague society. Yet these benefits come at an unimaginable cost. The lives of millions, the destruction of families, communities torn apart, knowledge and culture lost with those who carried it. The plague is not yet finished. It will return as it has before, bringing new waves of death. Yet humanity will survive, adapting to each outbreak, developing new responses, gradually building knowledge that will, centuries later, finally conquer this invisible enemy. What you cannot know is that you stand at a turning point in history. The world that will emerge from the ashes of the Black Death will be fundamentally different from what came before. The seeds of the Renaissance are being planted in these years of recovery. The rigid feudal system is beginning its long, slow decline. The unquestioned authority of traditional power structures, both secular and religious, has been shaken, and on a biological level, the plague has reshaped the human species itself, selecting for genetic traits that will influence health and disease resistance for generations to come. Your brother's survival, far from being merely personal good fortune, represents an evolutionary chapter in humanity's endless dance with the microscopic organisms that both sustain and threaten us. Tomorrow, as a new day dawns on your changed world, you'll continue the work of rebuilding, of adapting, of finding a way forward. That's what plague survivors have always done throughout history. They carry on, bearing the weight of memory while facing toward the future. And in doing so, they reshape the world in ways that will echo through centuries to come. The story of survival we have been following through the Black Death of the 14th century is far from the only tale of courage and genetic luck in humanity's long dance with plague. As the soft darkness of sleep envelops you, let us journey forward through time to another village, another outbreak, and another remarkable story of sacrifice and survival. 300 years have passed since the first devastating waves of the Black Death swept through Europe. It is now the summer of 1665, and we find ourselves in Eyam, a small village nestled in the picturesque hills of Derbyshire, England. Eyam is a peaceful community of about 800 souls, mostly farmers and lead miners who work the rich veins running beneath the limestone landscape. Life here follows the familiar rhythms of rural England. The villagers rise with the sun, tend their fields and animals, work in the small local industries, attend services at the parish church of St. Lawrence, and gather at the local tavern to share news and companionship. It is a close-knit community where everyone knows everyone else, where families have lived for generations, where the bonds of neighborly care have been forged through shared joys and hardships. What the people of Iam do not know is that they are about to face the greatest test imaginable, one that will write their village's name into history and enshrine their collective sacrifice in legend. The plague has returned to England. In London, the disease that people still call the Black Death, though we now know it as bubonic plague, is cutting a deadly swath through the crowded streets of the capital. By the time it is finished, it will kill an estimated 100,000 Londoners, nearly a quarter of the city's population. This outbreak will become known as the Great Plague of London, the last major epidemic of bubonic plague in England. For now, the villagers of Iam feel secure in their isolation. The plague is a city problem, they tell themselves, unlikely to reach their remote community nestled in the Derbyshire Hills, far from major trade routes and urban centers. But fate has other plans. In late August 1665, a package arrives in Iam, addressed to the local tailor, Alexander Hadfield. It contains a bundle of cloth from London, perhaps designs for the latest fashions or fabrics not available locally. Hadfield's assistant, George Vickers, who lodges with the tailor and his family, unpacks the parcel. The cloth feels damp after its long journey, so Vickers hangs it by the fire to dry, unwittingly releasing the deadly cargo hidden within its folds. Fleas carrying the plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis. Within days, George Vickers falls ill with a raging fever. The telltale buboes, swollen, painful lymph nodes, appear in his neck and armpits. The village watches in horror as this strong young man rapidly deteriorates. By September 7th, 1665, Vickers is dead, the first plague victim in Iam. Panic ripples through the community as more people sicken. By the end of September, 4 more residents of Iam have died, all from households near Vickers's lodgings. The plague has gained its first foothold. As autumn progresses, the situation worsens. More villagers fall ill, and the death rate climbs. Some families lose multiple members within days of each other. The gravediggers can barely keep pace with the mounting fatalities. The natural reaction in such circumstances is flight. In London, anyone who could afford to, including King Charles II and his court, had fled the plagued city for the safety of country retreats. The wealthy residents of Iam, too, begin making preparations to leave, to seek refuge in uninfected areas until the danger passes. It is at this critical moment that 2 men step forward with an extraordinary proposition, one that will save countless lives beyond Iam, while condemning many within the village to almost certain death. William Mompesson, the recently appointed rector of Iam, and his predecessor, Thomas Stanley, a man still held in high regard by the community, proposed that the village quarantine itself, cutting off all contact with the outside world to prevent the plague from spreading to nearby towns and villages. They understand that by doing so, they are trapping the disease within their community, placing themselves and their families at grave risk. It is a staggering request. In essence, the villagers are being asked to sacrifice themselves, to accept that many more of them will die, to protect strangers in surrounding areas. Remarkably, they agree. The village boundary becomes a cordon sanitaire, a line between life and death that no resident of Ayam will cross. Food and supplies are left at designated boundary stones by outsiders, particularly the Earl of Devonshire from nearby Chatsworth House, who promises to provide for the isolated villagers. Money to pay for these provisions is placed in vinegar-filled holes in the rocks, as it is believed vinegar will disinfect the coins. What follows is one of the most poignant and heroic episodes in the long history of humanity's battle with infectious disease. Summer turns to autumn, autumn to winter, and winter to spring. Through it all, the plague continues its deadly work within the confines of Ayam. Entire families are wiped out. Children are orphaned, only to die themselves days later. Houses stand empty, their occupants buried hastily in gardens and fields, since the churchyard quickly becomes full. Within this tragedy, individual stories emerge that illuminate the extraordinary nature of human courage, suffering, and survival. Elizabeth Hancock, a farmer's wife living at Riley Farm on the edge of the village, endures a loss almost beyond comprehension. In the space of just 8 days in August 1666, the plague claims her husband and 6 children. With no one to help her, neighbors fear approaching the infected household. Elizabeth single-handedly drags each body to a field near their home and buries them herself. The remarkable aspect of Elizabeth's story is not just her unimaginable fortitude in the face of such devastating personal loss. It is the fact that despite handling the plague-riddled bodies of her entire family, she never contracts the disease herself. Like the survivors we met in our earlier tale, Elizabeth likely carries the CCR5 Delta 32 genetic mutation that offers protection against the plague bacterium. The Riley Graves, as they come to be known, stand to this day as a testament to one woman's suffering and endurance. Another extraordinary tale is that of Marshall Howe, Ayam's unofficial gravedigger. As the death toll mounts, Howe takes on the grim task of burial, not out of noble sacrifice, but for more mercenary reasons. He takes the opportunity to loot the homes of the dead before disposing of their bodies. Despite this unsavory behavior, Howe's story contains an element of medical mystery. He handles dozens, perhaps hundreds, of infected corpses. He enters plague-ridden houses that others avoid at all costs. By all logic, he should be among the first to die. Yet, Marshall Howe survives the entire outbreak without ever showing symptoms of the disease. Modern science, again, suggests a likely explanation: the protective genetic mutation that prevents the plague bacterium from gaining entry to his cells. What Howe attributes to luck or divine protection is actually the result of a tiny alteration in his DNA, one that gives him an edge in humanity's evolutionary battle against its microscopic enemy. Then there is the heartbreaking story of Emot Siddall and Roland Tora, young lovers separated by the village quarantine. Emot lives within Iam, while Roland is from a neighboring village outside the cordon. As the quarantine takes effect, they find themselves suddenly and indefinitely separated. Unwilling to completely lose contact, they arrange to meet at a safe distance across Cucklet Delph, a natural ravine that marks part of the village boundary. Standing far apart to avoid any risk of transmitting infection, they can at least see each other and exchange words of comfort and devotion. These brief, distant meetings sustain them through the early months of the quarantine. But as spring turns to summer in 1666, and the plague reaches its peak intensity in Iam, Emot stops coming to their meeting place. Roland continues to appear day after day, calling her name, receiving no answer. Only after the quarantine finally ends does Roland learn the truth. Emot died in April, one of many young victims claimed by the plague. Their love story, cut short by disease, but marked by faithful devotion, remains one of Iam's most enduring legends. Perhaps strangest of all is the tale of Margaret Blackwell, who fell gravely ill with plague symptoms. Delirious with fever, she drank deeply from a pot of bacon fat that had been rendered on the hearth. She drank the greasy liquid, and to everyone's astonishment, Margaret recovered. For centuries, villagers would tell the story of how bacon fat cured the plague. The truth is likely more complex. Margaret probably carried the genetic resistance we've discussed and would have recovered regardless of her unusual beverage choice. But the legend persisted, a reminder of how desperately people searched for any treatment that might save them from the plague's deadly grip. Through it all, the village's religious leaders provide what comfort they can. William Mompesson, who proposed the quarantine alongside Thomas Stanley, pays a terrible personal price for his courageous stand. His wife, Catherine, contracts the plague while helping care for sick villagers and dies in her husband's arms in August 1666, at the height of the outbreak. In a letter to his children, who had been sent away before the quarantine, he writes of his determination to minister to his suffering congregation until the end. Church services move outdoors to Cucklet Delph, where fresh air is believed to reduce the risk of contagion. Villagers stand far apart from one another as they pray, an early form of what we now call social distancing. Even in the darkest hours, when death seems to lurk in every shadow, the community maintains its spiritual practices, finding solace in familiar rituals, even as the world collapses around them. Not everyone behaves nobly, of course. There are instances of looting, of neighbors refusing to help one another, of panic overriding compassion. One villager, Mary Cooper, attempts to break the quarantine, fleeing toward the safety of Sheffield before being caught and returned to Iam. But these lapses are exceptions. The overwhelming story of Iam is one of extraordinary collective sacrifice for the greater good. By the time the plague runs its course in November 1666, it has raged through Iam for 14 months. Of the approximately 800 villagers present when the outbreak began, only about 340 remain alive. Entire family lines are extinguished. The village's social fabric is torn apart, with gaps that will take generations to mend. Yet their sacrifice achieves its purpose. The plague remains contained within Iam's boundaries. Surrounding communities, which would almost certainly have been infected had the villagers fled, are spared the devastation. Thousands of lives are saved by the deliberate choice of a few hundred to face death rather than spread it. In the quiet aftermath, as the survivors begin the long process of rebuilding their shattered community, they cannot know the legacy they have created. They cannot imagine that 3.5 centuries later, their story will still be told as an example of extraordinary communal courage and sacrifice. They cannot know that the plague that devastated their village was the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in England. That something about the particular strain of Yersinia pestis that struck in the 1660s would make it less viable in later years, or that improvements in sanitation and housing would gradually reduce the rat populations that spread the disease. They cannot know that scientists of the future will take a deep interest in their descendants, discovering unusually high rates of the CCR5 delta 32 mutation among people whose family lines trace back to IM survivors, stronger evidence of how infectious disease shapes human evolution through natural selection. And they certainly cannot know that their example will resonate with special poignancy in the early 21st century, when a global pandemic once again forces communities worldwide to make difficult choices about isolation, quarantine, and collective sacrifice for the common good. All they know is that they have survived an ordeal almost beyond comprehension. They have watched neighbors, friends, and family die by the dozens. They have maintained their self-imposed isolation through summer heat and winter cold. The survivors of IM face practical challenges immediately. Fields have gone untended, businesses have collapsed, and housing lies in disrepair. With so many dead, traditional family structures have been shattered. Children need homes. Widows and widowers must decide whether to remarry, and property ownership becomes complicated when entire families have been wiped out. Yet the human capacity for resilience, which we have seen throughout this journey, asserts itself once more. Newcomers arrive to claim abandoned property and bring fresh life to the depleted village. Those with useful skills find themselves in high demand, able to command better compensation than before. The plague has acted as a terrible but effective form of natural selection. Those who survive, whether through genetic resistance, circumstantial luck, or some combination of factors, become the foundation for the village's rebirth. Their descendants will carry the genetic legacy of plague resistance, though they won't understand this inheritance for centuries to come. For some survivors, the psychological scars never fully heal. Elizabeth Hancock, who buried her entire family with her own hands, eventually remarries and has more children, but villagers report that she is never quite the same. William Mompesson the rector who lost his beloved Catherine, leaves Iam in 1669 to take up a position elsewhere. He eventually remarries and lives to the age of 71, but his letters reveal that he never forgets the horror of those plague months or the sacrifice of his congregation. As for the village itself, Iam gradually recovers its population, though some family names disappear forever from its records. The quarantine becomes part of local folklore, and the village, now known as the Plague Village, begins to draw visitors curious about its tragic past. The Riley graves, the boundary stones, and other physical remnants of the quarantine become informal monuments. By the 21st century, Iam is a well-established stop on heritage tourism routes through Derbyshire. The village museum tells the story of the plague and quarantine. The parish church displays artifacts and commemorations. A plague Sunday service has been held annually since 1866, marking the community's sacrifice. But Iam is not merely a historical curiosity. It remains a living community where descendants of plague survivors still make their homes. Some carry the same surnames as those who lived through the 1665-66 outbreak. The Hancocks, the Siddalls, the Blackwells, and genetic testing has revealed that some still carry the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation that may have saved their ancestors from the plague. The story of Iam reminds us that history is not simply a collection of dates and events to be memorized. It is the lived experience of real people facing extraordinary circumstances, people whose choices, sacrifices, and survival shape the world that follows. On that quiet Derbyshire hillside, the past remains present. The villagers who chose to isolate themselves, knowing many would die as a result, could not have imagined how long their story would endure, or how meaningful it would remain to future generations. They acted out of immediate concern for their neighbors in surrounding communities, not for historical legacy. And perhaps that is what makes their sacrifice so powerful. It was made without expectation of recognition or reward, simply because it was the right thing to do in a world that often seems to prioritize individual benefit over collective welfare. While Iam's story from the 1660s shows us the courage of a single village, the great pandemic of the 1300s transformed entire societies. As we drift deeper into this historical dreamscape, let's explore how surviving such a catastrophe reshaped the medieval world. Imagine yourself once more in that small village we visited earlier, but now it is 1352. The initial waves of the plague have finally subsided, leaving a transformed landscape, both physically and socially. As you walk through the village that was once home to 200 souls, you count perhaps 90 people remaining. Empty cottages stand like hollow-eyed skulls along the lane, their thatched roofs beginning to collapse without maintenance, their gardens overgrown with weeds. Yet amid this desolation, subtle signs of change are appearing, changes that will eventually alter the very foundations of medieval society. In the fields surrounding the village, the transformation is immediately visible. Before the plague, every available piece of land was cultivated, even marginal soils that yielded poor harvests. Generations of population growth had pushed farming onto less and less productive terrain as people desperately tried to produce enough food for growing families. Now, with so many dead, land is suddenly abundant. Survivors abandon the least fertile fields entirely, focusing their labor on the best soils. This simple shift dramatically improves crop yields per person. Where once a peasant family might have struggled to produce enough to feed themselves after paying taxes and tithes, now they often harvest a surplus. For those who survived the apocalyptic mortality, food is more plentiful than it has been in living memory. After centuries of existing on the edge of hunger, this abundance feels miraculous, a small compensation for the emotional devastation of losing so many family members and neighbors. Population levels would not increase again for generations as diets improved. But the most profound changes come in the relationship between workers and landowners. The massive population loss, roughly half of Europe's people, creates an acute labor shortage. Fields still need plowing, crops need harvesting, cloth needs weaving, buildings need repairs. Yet, there are simply not enough hands to do all the necessary work. For surviving peasants and artisans, this new reality brings unprecedented leverage. Consider the case of Thomas Fletcher, a plowman in your village. Before the plague, he worked the fields 6 days a week in exchange for a small plot of land to farm for himself and his family. If he complained or failed to provide the required labor service, dozens of other hungry peasants stood ready to take his place. Now, with half the village's workers dead, the local manor's steward approaches Thomas with an extraordinary offer: a larger plot of land, a reduction in labor service from 6 days to 3, and the freedom to work for wages on other manors if he wishes. The steward makes this offer not out of generosity, but necessity. Without Thomas's skilled plowing, fields will lie fallow, and everyone, including the lord of the manor, will suffer. Similar scenes play out across Europe. Peasants who for generations had been bound to the land, as serfs, suddenly find themselves with options. Many landlords offer freedom from serfdom as an incentive to keep workers on their estates. Others convert labor obligations to simple rent payments, allowing peasants to farm the land as they see fit, as long as they pay the agreed amount. For skilled workers, the changes are even more dramatic. Masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, weavers all find their services in desperate demand. Wages for such workers double, triple, or even quadruple in the years immediately following the plague. A skilled carpenter who could once barely feed his family now builds a 2-room house with glass windows, wears better clothing, and eats meat 3 times a week. These changes alarm the nobility and wealthy merchant classes. They see the traditional social order crumbling as former serfs demand better treatment and common laborers live like minor gentry. Throughout Europe, authorities attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and force workers back into their previous conditions. In England, the government issues the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, followed by the more comprehensive Statute of Labourers in 1351. These laws prohibit employers from offering higher wages than had been paid before the plague, forbid workers from leaving their homes to seek better opportunities elsewhere, and attempt to fix prices for food and other goods. Similar legislation appears across Europe. France enacts wage controls in 1351, as does the city-state of Florence. The Spanish Kingdom of Castile tries to prevent peasant mobility with its own labor laws. But these efforts largely fail. The labor shortage is simply too severe, the economic pressures too great. Enforcement proves nearly impossible in rural areas where local officials, themselves often dependent on good relations with the remaining workers, turn a blind eye to violations. Workers develop creative ways to circumvent wage controls. A carpenter prohibited from accepting more than a certain daily wage might receive gifts of food, clothing, or housing in addition to his official pay. A farm laborer might work slowly or carelessly unless offered better terms than the law allows. For those enforcing the laws, the mathematics is unforgiving. Before the plague, a lord might have had 100 peasants working his land. Now he has 50 or fewer. Punishing one worker by imprisonment or fines only worsens his labor shortage. And if he treats his workers too harshly, they might simply leave, regardless of legal prohibitions against such mobility, knowing they will find welcome employment elsewhere. The situation comes to a head in various peasant revolts across Europe. In 1358, the rural areas around Paris erupt in the Jacquerie Rebellion, as peasants attack castles and noble estates. Though brutally suppressed, it demonstrates the new confidence of the laboring classes. In England, tensions simmer for decades until 1381, when they explode in the Peasants' Revolt. Led by Wat Tyler, Jack Straw, and a radical priest named John Ball, tens of thousands of commoners march on London, demanding an end to serfdom, the abolition of the hated poll tax, and greater social equality. John Ball's famous sermon captures the revolutionary spirit of the moment. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? He asks rhetorically, questioning the very idea of aristocratic privilege. From the beginning, all men were created alike, and our bondage or servitude came in by the unjust oppression of naughty men. Though the English revolt, like the Jacquerie, is eventually suppressed through a combination of false promises and brutal force, it represents a profound shift in consciousness. Peasants who once accepted their subordinate position as divinely ordained now openly question the social hierarchy. Workers who formerly had little choice but to accept whatever terms were offered now demand better treatment as their due. The economic and social transformations following the plague are not limited to rural areas. Towns and cities experience their own profound changes. Urban centers had suffered particularly high mortality during the pandemic due to their crowded conditions. Florence, one of medieval Europe's largest cities, loses as much as 75% of its population. This devastating loss creates opportunities for survivors. Housing, previously scarce and expensive in successful cities, suddenly becomes abundant and affordable. Apprentices find themselves elevated to master status years earlier than normal, as guilds lose many of their senior members. Women, traditionally excluded from many occupations, enter trades left vacant by dead male relatives. Consider the story of Margarita, a weaver's widow in a small market town. Before the plague, she was permitted to help her husband in his workshop, but could not operate as an independent artisan. Guild regulations expressly forbade women from owning a weaving business. When her husband dies of plague, leaving Margarita with his tools, loom, and the expertise she had gained working alongside him, the depleted Weavers Guild faces a choice: enforce the prohibition against female members and lose a skilled practitioner, or adapt to the new reality. Faced with falling membership and rising demand for cloth, the Guild admits Margarita as a full member, one of dozens of similar compromises made across Europe as necessity trumps tradition. Though such opportunities for women would eventually contract as populations recovered. For several generations after the plague, women enjoy expanded economic roles unimaginable before the pandemic. The plague's aftermath also witnesses changes in fashion, art, and architecture. The immense mortality creates a new consciousness of death's inevitability and life's fragility. The macabre emerges as an artistic theme. Skeletal figures, death's heads, scenes of the dance of death, where skeletons lead people from all social classes to the grave. Yet, alongside this morbid fascination comes a celebration of life and its pleasures. Survivors, perhaps conscious of how quickly existence can end, embrace luxury and beauty with renewed appreciation. Among those who can afford it, clothing becomes more elaborate and has both the authority and motivation to stop her. Religious attitudes undergo their own transformation. The Church, which had dominated medieval intellectual and spiritual life, faces a crisis of authority. Many priests and monks fled their posts during the plague, abandoning their flocks when spiritual comfort was most needed. Others stayed and died, leaving parishes without leadership. Monasteries, with their communal living arrangements, suffered particularly high mortality rates, wiping out centuries of accumulated knowledge and tradition. More fundamentally, the plague raises uncomfortable theological questions. If the disaster is divine punishment, as many church authorities claim, why do the virtuous and sinful die alike? Why do devout monks perish, while seemingly impious lay people survive? If prayer and penance are the remedies, why do outbreaks often hit monasteries hardest of all? No satisfactory answers emerge from traditional theology. Instead, two divergent religious trends develop. Some survivors embrace even more fervent piety, seeing their survival as evidence of divine favor that demands grateful devotion. Others adopt a more skeptical, questioning attitude toward religious authorities who failed to explain or mitigate the catastrophe. This questioning spirit, combined with the economic changes that give ordinary people more resources and leisure time, creates fertile ground for the intellectual flowering that will eventually become the Renaissance. When fewer hands must produce society's necessities, more minds can turn to art, philosophy, science, and literature. Education, previously restricted mainly to clergy and nobility, gradually becomes available to a wider segment of society. Newly prosperous merchants and artisans want their children to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic skills useful for business, as well as markers of rising social status. Small schools appear in towns and even larger villages, teaching practical knowledge alongside traditional religious instruction. The plague's demographic shock also accelerates technological innovation. With labor scarce and expensive, techniques that save human effort become increasingly valuable. Watermills, long used for grinding grain, are adapted for new purposes, powering bellows for blast furnaces, driving hammers for metalworking, and fulling cloth. Printing technology, which will eventually revolutionize the spread of knowledge through Europe, receives early impetus from the post-plague labor shortage. Handwritten manuscripts, each requiring months of a skilled scribe's time, become prohibitively expensive when such workers can command premium wages. The economic pressure to find mechanical alternatives helps drive the development of movable type printing in the mid-15th century. Perhaps most profoundly, the plague experience shakes medieval Europe's acceptance of unchanging tradition. When half the population dies in a few short years, when social hierarchies crumble and rebuild in new forms, when previously unquestioned authorities fail to provide protection or explanation, the idea that the world must remain as it has always been loses its power. After the Black Death, more people can imagine alternatives to existing arrangements, different ways of organizing work, distributing resources, and structuring authority. Most of these alternatives are never realized, and many that are implemented prove temporary. But the psychological barrier against change itself weakens, creating space for the innovations in thought, technology, art, and social organization that will eventually transform medieval Europe into the early modern world. For individuals living through these changes, the experience is less about grand historical transformations and more about practical daily adjustments. Thomas, the plowman, doesn't think about the decline of feudalism. He thinks about negotiating better terms with the manor steward so his family can eat better than before. Margarita, the weaver, doesn't consider herself part of a gender revolution. She's simply using her skills to support herself after losing her husband. Yet these individual adaptations, multiplied across millions of survivors throughout Europe, collectively reshape society. Like water gradually wearing away stone, the countless small decisions made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances erode and eventually transform the seemingly solid structures of medieval life. Not all these changes are immediately positive, of course. the labor shortage that benefits workers creates hardship for many landowners. Some estates fail entirely, their owners unable to adapt to the new economic realities. Churches, monasteries, and charitable institutions that depended on steady rents and donations struggle to maintain their operations with reduced income. Criminal activity increases in some areas as poorly supervised young men with improved incomes spend freely on alcohol and find themselves in trouble. Abandoned properties in rural areas sometimes become havens for outlaws. Urban governments worry about maintaining order with depleted watch forces. For several decades after the initial plague outbreak, recurring smaller epidemics continue to hit European communities, preventing population recovery. The changes wrought by the Black Death have time to become entrenched. What might have been temporary disruptions instead become new norms. By the time population pressure begins to reverse some of the economic advantages for common workers, other aspects of medieval society have been permanently altered. For the peasant family we followed through our story, the decades after the plague bring gradual improvement. Your brother, who miraculously survived his bout with the disease, eventually takes over a neighboring farm left vacant by a family with no survivors. What would have been impossible before the plague? A peasant accumulating a significant land holding becomes achievable in the depopulated countryside. Your father, whose carpentry skills are in high demand, secures a contract to help rebuild the local church, damaged by years of neglect during the plague years. The payment he receives allows him to add a second room to your family's cottage and replace the dirt floor with wooden planks, small luxuries that would have seemed unimaginable in the pre-plague era. Your mother teaches you and your sister to read, a skill she learned while working as a servant in a merchant's household before marriage. Before the plague, such knowledge would have had little practical value for peasant children. But in the changing world of the late 14th century, literacy opens doors previously closed to those of humble birth. One autumn evening, as your family gathers around the hearth after the day's work, your father speaks words that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Perhaps you could be a clerk, he says to you, nodding thoughtfully. The abbey is seeking someone who can read and write to help with their records. The pay would be good, and the work is not hard on the body. Your brother laughs, not unkindly. A clerk from our family. What would grandfather say to that? The idea of a peasant's child entering such work would indeed have seemed absurd to earlier generations, for whom rigid social boundaries appeared as natural and immovable as the stars. But as you fall asleep that night, the possibility settles in your mind, not as an outlandish dream, but as a genuine opportunity. This, perhaps, is the most significant legacy of the Black Death. Not just the immediate changes in wages, working conditions, and social structures, but the expansion of what ordinary people can imagine for themselves and their children. A world that once seemed fixed and unchangeable has been broken open by catastrophe and is slowly being rebuilt into something different than what came before. The medieval certainties that once defined life have given way to a world of new possibilities, leading to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and ultimately the emergence of the modern world. As our journey through the world of plague survivors nears its end, let's widen our view to see how the ripples from the Black Death continue to spread outward through time, shaping the world in ways both subtle and profound. The echoes of this medieval catastrophe still resonate today in our very biology. We carry the genetic legacy of the Black Death in our DNA, a mutation passed down through generations, enriched in the European gene pool because those who carried it were more likely to survive and have children. Fast forward 600 years to the late 20th century. A new pandemic emerges, HIV/AIDS, killing millions worldwide. Medical researchers racing to understand this new disease make a startling discovery. Some people appear naturally resistant to HIV infection, despite repeated exposure. Further investigation reveals why. Many carry the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation, the same genetic variation that helped their ancestors survive the Black Death. The connection becomes clear when scientists understand how both diseases operate. Both the plague bacterium and HIV use the CCR5 protein as a gateway into human cells. The Delta 32 mutation alters this protein, effectively barricading the door that these pathogens try to enter. A genetic adaptation selected by one deadly disease in the 14th century unexpectedly provides protection against an entirely different threat in the 20th. This discovery led to the development of new HIV drugs that block the CCR5 receptor, mimicking what the mutation does naturally. In a very real sense, medieval plague survivors have helped save lives in our modern age, their genetic legacy providing a crucial clue in fighting a disease they could never have imagined. But the biological impact of the plague extends beyond this single mutation. The Black Death acted as an intense force of natural selection, potentially influencing other aspects of the immune system in Europeans. Today's population descends disproportionately from the survivors, those whose bodies, for various genetic reasons, could better withstand the onslaught of Yersinia pestis. Some scientists theorize that certain autoimmune diseases more common in European populations, conditions where the immune system attacks the body's own tissues, might be an unintended consequence of this selection. Our ancestors survived the plague because their immune responses were particularly vigorous. That same heightened reactivity, however, may predispose their descendants to conditions like rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, where the immune system becomes overactive. These biological connections between past and present remind us that pandemics don't merely kill and then vanish from history. They reshape the human species itself. In the immediate aftermath, the labor shortages, wage increases, and social mobility we explored last night eventually faded as Europe's population recovered. Yet certain fundamental changes became permanent. consider the institution of serfdom, which had bound peasants to the land for generations before the plague. In Western Europe, this system never fully recovered from the disruption caused by the Black Death. Though landlords attempted to reimpose old restrictions, the demographic reality worked against them. Land remained relatively abundant and labor scarce for centuries, giving workers leverage that gradually eroded feudal obligations. By the end of the Middle Ages, serfdom had largely disappeared from England, France, and the Low Countries, replaced by various rental arrangements that allowed much greater personal freedom. Peasants still worked the land, but increasingly as tenants who paid rent rather than as serfs bound by hereditary obligations of labor and subservience. Eastern Europe followed a different path. There, the nobility succeeded in reimposing and even strengthening serfdom after the plague, creating what historians call the Second Serfdom that would persist into the 19th century. This divergence between Western and Eastern European social systems, one moving toward greater freedom for common people, the other toward more rigid control, would profoundly influence these regions' subsequent development. The Black Death also accelerated fundamental changes in religious life. The Catholic Church, which had dominated medieval intellectual and spiritual life, faced challenges to its authority in the plague's aftermath. Questions about why prayers went unanswered, why religious processions failed to stop the disease, and why devout monks died alongside sinners created cracks in the edifice of unquestioning faith. These cracks would widen in later centuries. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, with its challenge to Catholic authority and emphasis on individual interpretation of Scripture, found fertile ground in a population already predisposed to question religious orthodoxy. While the Reformation had many causes, historians see echoes of plague-era disillusionment in the willingness of millions to break with centuries of tradition. Even art and literature were transformed by the Black Death experience. Medieval artwork often focused on religious themes, depicting biblical stories, saints' lives, and divine figures. After the plague, new motifs appeared: the dance of death, showing skeletons leading people from all social classes to the grave, reminders of mortality in still life paintings, and a greater focus on the human experience rather than purely divine matters. This shift toward humanism, attention to human experience, emotion, and achievement would blossom in the Renaissance, along with reclaimed classical knowledge from Greek and Roman sources. This human-centered perspective would fundamentally alter how Europeans understood themselves and their world. The plague's impact extended even to language. Our modern English vocabulary still carries echoes of the Black Death experience. We speak of quarantine, a word derived from the Italian quarantina giorni, or 40 days, the length of time ships were required to remain isolated in Venetian harbors during plague outbreaks. We describe someone as having a deadline. Originally, a line drawn around a prison beyond, which guards could shoot escaping prisoners. but similar to the boundaries drawn around quarantined plague areas. Even seemingly innocuous childhood rhymes may carry plague memories. Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down, has been interpreted by some as a reference to plague symptoms. The rosy rash, attempted remedies, sweet-smelling posies carried to ward off disease, and the outcome, ashes from cremation, falling down in death. Though scholars debate this interpretation, it suggests how deeply plague imagery may be embedded in cultural memory. The Black Death also transformed humanity's relationship with disease itself. Before the plague, illness was generally seen as either divine punishment or the result of imbalanced bodily humors, with little concept of contagion as we understand it today. The plague's obvious pattern of spread, moving along trade routes, passing from person to person in close contact, made it impossible to ignore the contagious nature of at least some diseases. Communities developed practical responses that, while not based on germ theory, which would not emerge until the 19th century, nonetheless incorporated effective public health measures. Ships were quarantined, infected households isolated, and plague victims and their belongings often burned. Cities appointed public health boards with extraordinary powers during outbreaks, establishing principles of epidemic management that would influence public health practices for centuries. These pragmatic approaches, developed through bitter experience rather than scientific understanding, saved countless lives in subsequent plague outbreaks. By the time the last major European plague epidemic struck Marseille in 1720, authorities had learned to implement cordons sanitaires, strict quarantines, and careful monitoring that successfully limited the outbreak largely to that city and surrounding areas. Such measures came too late for the millions who perished in the initial pandemic, of course. But the knowledge gained from the Black Death experience helped mitigate later outbreaks of plague and informed responses to other epidemic diseases. When cholera struck Europe in the 19th century, public health officials drew on plague management traditions to contain its spread, imperfectly at first, but with increasing effectiveness as scientific understanding improved. The plague's legacy extends even to modern pandemic management. Many of the approaches employed during recent COVID-19 outbreaks, quarantines, travel restrictions, contact tracing, isolation of the infected, have roots in methods developed centuries ago in response to the Black Death. Even the tension between economic impacts and public health measures echoes medieval debates about whether to close city gates and markets during plague outbreaks. Perhaps most profoundly, the Black Death experience shaped how humans think about catastrophe itself. Medieval Europeans lived in a world where sudden disasters seemed ever present. War, famine, smaller disease, outbreaks regularly claimed lives. But the scale and speed of the plague surpassed anything in living memory or recorded history. This encounter with near-apocalyptic mortality forced a kind of collective psychological adjustment. Communities that survived learned they could endure previously unimaginable loss and still continue. Individuals discovered reserves of resilience they might never have known they possessed. Societies developed institutional memory and adaptive practices for future crises. This capacity for resilience in the face of catastrophe remains one of humanity's most valuable assets. Throughout history, communities have faced disasters that seemed insurmountable. Yet somehow, life continues. People mourn their dead, rebuild their settlements, adapt their practices, and move forward, carrying the memory of what was lost, while creating something new from what remains. We see this pattern repeated after every major catastrophe, from the volcanic eruption that buried Pompeii to the earthquake that devastated Lisbon in 1755, from the 1918 influenza pandemic to more recent natural disasters and disease outbreaks. The Black Death, as perhaps the most extreme example of such a calamity in recorded history, demonstrated the remarkable human capacity to endure, adapt, and ultimately continue. This is not to minimize the suffering caused by such events. The plague brought pain beyond imagining, tore apart families and communities, and ended millions of unique lives that each contained a universe of experience and potential. No silver lining of social change or biological adaptation can justify such loss. Yet understanding how humanity weathered this storm offers perspective on our own capacity to face present and future challenges. Climate change, emerging diseases, technological disruptions. Our world contains no shortage of existential threats. The history of the Black Death reminds us that previous generations faced their own seemingly insurmountable crises and found ways to continue. For the individual plague survivors whose stories we followed these past nights, such grand historical patterns would have meant little compared to their immediate lived experience. Thomas, the plowman, negotiating better working conditions in the labor-scarce aftermath, wasn't thinking about the long-term decline of feudalism. Elizabeth Hancock, burying her family on the hillside above Iam, couldn't have imagined her genetic legacy might protect descendants from a 20th century disease. Yet collectively, these individual experiences and adaptations created the sweeping changes that transformed medieval society into something new. This is how history often works, not through the conscious decisions of great leaders or dramatic turning points alone, but through the accumulated effects of millions of ordinary people responding to extraordinary circumstances as best they can. As we conclude our journey through the world of plague survivors, what lessons might we take from their experience? Perhaps the most fundamental is an appreciation for human resilience. The Black Death inflicted losses almost beyond comprehension. Half the population in many areas, entire families and villages wiped out. Centuries of accumulated knowledge and culture lost with those who carried it. Yet somehow, survivors gathered the will to continue to rebuild, to create new families and communities from the fragments of what remained. We might also reflect on how catastrophe, for all its horror, sometimes creates possibility. The rigid social structures of medieval Europe, which had seemed as immutable as the turning of the seasons, proved vulnerable to disruption when the demographic realities changed. People previously confined to predetermined social roles found new opportunities in the aftermath. Though we would never wish for disaster as an agent of change, history shows that transformation often emerges from crisis. The plague story reminds us too of our biological connectedness, both to each other and to the countless microscopic organisms with which we share the planet. The Black Death bacterium, Yersinia pestis, shaped human genetics, social structures, economic systems, and cultural expressions in ways that continue to influence our world today. Other microbes have played similarly influential roles throughout history. We exist in constant relationship with an invisible biological world that can both sustain and threaten us. Finally, perhaps the plague narrative offers perspective on our own mortality and vulnerability. Medieval people lived with death as a constant companion in ways most modern Westerners do not. The plague brought mortality into even sharper focus, inspiring artwork, literature, and philosophy that contemplated life's fragility and brevity. This awareness need not be morbid or depressing. Indeed, many who survived the plague embraced life with renewed appreciation, understanding firsthand how quickly and unexpectedly it could end. There is wisdom in this perspective, not a fearful obsession with death, but a clear-eyed recognition of life's preciousness, precisely because it is limited and uncertain. As our story ends and sleep approaches, imagine once more that medieval village we first visited, now a generation after the plague has passed. The population has begun to recover, with new children playing in the streets and young families occupying cottages that stood empty for years. The survivors, now elders, carry the memory of what happened, both the horrors they witnessed and the changes they helped create in the aftermath. They could not know how their experience would echo through centuries, influencing everything from genetic inheritance to social structures, from artistic expression to approaches to public health. They simply lived their lives as best they could in circumstances they never chose, displaying that remarkable human capacity for adaptation and perseverance that has carried our species through countless challenges. And perhaps that is the most comforting thought to carry into dreams, that we, like those plague survivors, possess resources of resilience and adaptability we may not recognize until circumstances demand them. That life, for all its fragility, exhibits a persistent tendency to continue to rebuild, to find new paths forward when old ones are blocked. The Black Death survivors could never have imagined our world with its medical technologies, instant global communication, and scientific understanding of the very bacterium that caused their suffering. Nor can we fully envision the world our descendants will inhabit generations hence. But like those medieval ancestors, we move forward, carrying both the wounds of past catastrophes and the insights gained from surviving them, contributing in ways both small and large to the unfolding human story. Sleep well, knowing you are part of this long continuum of human experience, connected to those who came before and those who will follow, each generation facing its own challenges, each finding its own ways to endure, adapt, and ultimately continue the remarkable journey of our species through time.